For VR to succeed, game design needs a bit of an overhaul. Let's chat about it in the comments below, but first, my opinion. I'm Tarmack, and this is Feature Creep. Okay, so I've complained about VR in the past. I want the Rift and the HTC Vive in a bad way, not so keen on the PlayStation VR, but that's just a performance tick more than anything else because I have a PC that will handle VR itself. My complaints are in the area of the full isolation being likely to keep VR adoption by the general public low for quite some time, even perhaps as far as a few generations of VR. However, this video isn't a VR complaint, but rather a discussion of what aspects of game design need a revisit in order to work for VR. The last thing VR needs is afterthought porting of games that were designed for PC or console with the existing controls and interface. We can start with the obvious idea that first-person games are, of course, going to be the most likely and common source of VR titles, but in order to do first-person gaming in a VR setting, what other factors do you need to take into account? Well, as silly as it sounds, the player character needs a complete redesign. You need to be able to look down and see your feet, or maneuver your weapon so as to admire it. This whole thing is about immersion, so those little details are what can help keep your mind in the game. One avenue that I think is going to be a bit on the tough side is the idea of physical exhaustion. Here's an experiment. Take something moderately light but handheld and hold it out in front of you like you might with an assault weapon or an axe. Keep holding it out there for as long as you can. For PC and console gaming, the worst pain you're likely to experience is your butt hurting after sitting for too long, or your butt hurting after maybe losing a game. VR has the potential, if a game is designed poorly, to awaken what I'll refer to as the Minority Report problem. That is to say, controlling a computer by way of active hand movements isn't feasible without some kind of rest involved. You can rest your arms on the desk all day and have no problems, but hold a virtual gun up to your face for long periods and those arms will be burning after less than an hour of play. I'm not saying that this is necessarily a huge negative, but it is something that developers will need to consider when making their games. Absolutely, it's worth mentioning that VR works well at a desk, but it's fairly safe to say that a mouse and keyboard is less immersive than the kinds of hand movement controls that the VR teams are building. If immersion is your goal, these are major considerations. In fact, the idea of whether you're going to support sitting VR or standing VR actually affects quite a bit in how the game controls. Another thing that devs will need to be very careful of is taking camera control away from the player. Amnesia had some of this, for example, where you have that drugged or injured walk going on. I see that as a nausea trap myself. If you're given full look control, it stands to reason that they could take perhaps movement control away, trams, locked cells, roller coasters, etc., but should probably never take camera control away or hamper it at all. The platform already has somewhat of a motion sickness problem, though, from what I've heard, they are mitigating that factor pretty well with recent revisions. So what about sound? Sound design is frankly going to be even more important than it already is. For starters, every VR game needs surround sound. Sure, you could make one without it, but come on, that's like saying you can drive on the road with a Vespa, but why would you want to? It's going to be very interesting also to see how game designers choose to handle music. By and large, music is a mood setter in games. Personally, I see music being better if less frequent under a VR title. Something along the lines of Skyrim, where you've got a musician in a tavern for that sort of point directional focused sound. Or perhaps a radio in a more modern game with, again, that same point focused sound generation. But outside in the vast world, I wonder whether background music is actually a good idea. It could well be that the plethora of potential audio sources that the designers will be dealing with is more immersive without background music, at least in the first person. What about third person, though? I'd like to hear some expert discussion on the cognitive effect of controlling a player character from the view of the devil on the shoulder. I'm not sure how well that will translate into existing gameplay. That said, wouldn't it be an interesting design choice to have the third person character you see being a character that you influence but don't directly control from the shoulder as the little angel or devil? Of course, technically that would make it a first person game. The location of the camera, i.e. your head, in VR dramatically impacts some styles of titles even more than others, I would say. And what about RTS, top-down kinds of games? I can see games like Risk and such being played in VR very much like they're played in real life, on a table. Traditional RTS games, though, it seems to me present a bit of a problem. Now, I acknowledge that RTS games may simply not translate into VR well enough, but I'm willing to be hopeful. I think that a solid combination of outside the fog of war rendering and alteration of perspective could make it work. When I say outside the fog of war rendering, I mean beyond the edges of the map. If you're playing an RTS in VR, after the edge of the map there will be naught but empty space. If, on the other hand, a portion as far as can be reasonably seen from your position is rendered, even though you cannot traverse it, then immersion is increased. Alternatively, I could see a situation where the player is interacting with a virtual display themselves, upon which the top-down RTS is visible, again like a tabletop. but that of course requires rendering the room that they're in as well. For alteration of perspectives, I'm referring to tilting the map. Now, I could be mistaken here, but it seems to me that there would be a bit of a mental block to be sitting or standing vertically and playing a game where the physics of getting that view would require you to be lying face down. Most RTSs have some angle of perspective tilt, and increasing that tilt closer to the horizontal would be a potential solution. UI has to completely change, well, except for games that already have a HUD-style UI. Something like Elite Dangerous or Star Citizen are good examples of that kind of UI. But how do you handle player health if you don't have a HUD? Does the player have to look down to see if they're bleeding? Or do you put in a floating health bar that always is in the top left of the player vision no matter where they turn their head? It sounds silly, but the UI is how you interact with the game for quite a few features. So how do you modify that to work under a VR setup? So far, we've seen primarily tech demos and exploration-style VR titles. That's the big draw right now because people in general are still amazed by the basic concept of walking around and being able to look in all directions or interact with objects in the world. That wide-eyed wonder will continue for a while, but at some point we will start seeing core games being made with a VR primary focus. As a platform, it has the precision and speed necessary for the depth required for core mainstream products. And as the VR market starts to grow, whether or not it grows beyond a niche market, which I don't expect for quite some time, a lot of these sort of concerns start popping up. And the fact of the matter is that I've only scratched the surface of the design challenges that await VR devs. Actually, I'd love to interview somebody working with VR, from a game dev side to pick their brain on this topic further. Find out what aspects of design that have caused them issues along the way. It's definitely an interesting time to be a gamer. What other aspects of current game design do you feel will need some major thought in order to work under VR? Let's chat about it in the comments below. Feature Creep is a regular show every week, so if you didn't hate it and might like to come back next week to see what I ramble about then, subscribing will help you out with that goal. That's all I have to say. Tarmack out.